I am Pam Wakefield, a member of the Adult School Board. The title of tonight's lecture is Pro-Choice and Pro-Life, Any Common Ground. This is, of course, a very sensitive and delicate topic, and the lecture committee of the Adult School Board is very pleased to welcome Dr. Nancy Duff as tonight's speaker. Nancy has taught Christian ethics at Princeton Theological Seminary since 1990. She grew up in Tyler, Texas, and attended Austin College. Nancy received her Master's of Divinity from Union Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, and is ordained in the Presbyterian Church. She served as Associate Campus Minister at Austin College and then earned a PhD in Theology from Union Seminary in New York City. Among the courses Nancy teaches are issues in human sexuality, medical ethics, and the ethics of the Ten Commandments. She is married to David Mertz, a United Methodist minister. They have 2 children, a 19-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. Nancy, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and terrific to see all of you again, given how truly awful the weather is out there. I have been looking at this topic for quite a number of years, not just abortion, but from this particular angle, pro-choice and pro-life, any common ground. Years ago, I had a research assistant. I had this idea that, could we bring the two sides together to look at each other a bit more respectfully? And he actually found, this was many years ago, almost 20 years ago, that there was an organization, a Common Ground Network, and I don't know if they're still in existence, but I do know that they had been even just a few years ago, where they actually do Common Ground workshops, where they bring people together who are pro-choice and pro-life. It was started by advocates, leading spokespeople for each of those, where the point is not to convince someone from the other side to agree with you, but to see if you could actually come together, each side, for better understanding, and even to find areas where one can work together until you finally reach a point, obviously, where what one side wants to be legal, there's no compromise. And the point of those, again, was not compromise. What I want to do tonight doesn't have to do with trying to lead us into arenas where how might each side work against unwanted pregnancies or other factors that we may be able to identify in common. What I want to do is to try to analyze the debate where we can be respectful of each side, sometimes critical of each side, and each time then I will present what I'm calling a common ground response. 2 things that I'd like you to know about my comments. One is I finally decided just to say pro-choice, pro-life in alphabetical order. Used to, in order to be fair, I would try to switch it, sometimes say pro-life, pro-choice, and what I found out, I would get so confused that I would just inevitably speak of the wrong group when I meant it. And so just to be consistent and not trip up, I've just chosen to do it alphabetically. The other is I used to choose not to give my position up front, hoping that by the end people would say, well, where do you stand? I don't think that I could pull that off, and I no longer want to. I can tell you that I do hold what would be described as a pro-choice position in that I want abortion to be legal in some way. I'm not sure that I agree with the laws the way that they are presently stated. But part of the reason why I'm interested in doing this is sometimes I find that there are pro-choice arguments that are put forward that I want nothing to do with. So one of the things I want to remind us on both sides is that not everybody who's pro-choice or everybody who's pro-life thinks the same way. So sometimes when I'm criticizing or pointing out a weakness of one point of view or the other, you may hold to that view in general and say, but I don't say that. And I would readily acknowledge that. We don't all within those two groups present the same kinds of arguments, and sometimes may even want to distance ourselves from someone who is in general agreement with us. But we don't like their particular, the argument that they're putting forward. I want to start, another reason why I'm interested in this, not only on this topic, but I also give a similar presentation on homosexuality. I published an essay called How Do You Argue Issues Surrounding Homosexuality When You Know You're Right? Because I think that part of the problem in that debate is our inability to listen to each other respectfully. When I was a small child, younger grade school, my mother and my brother were in another room, my mother having that wonderful parental responsibility of helping her son with his homework. And at that particular night, it was math, and he had a compass, that has a very sharp end, this metal instrument, and apparently accidentally poked her hand while they were getting more and more upset about elementary school math. Maybe a little bit older, I guess, to have a compass. And I heard my brother say, I didn't do it on purpose. But my mother, who was upset at that point, only heard him say, I didn't do it. And she said, yes, you did. And he finished his sentence, his claim, on purpose. So he thought that she was accusing him of doing this, of hurting her on purpose. She thought that he was denying having done it at all. And I was sitting in another room thinking I could go in there, and he said, she said, and straighten this all up, but of course I couldn't. Now I can report my brother is an incredible son, and my mother's been an incredible mother, and they have a wonderful relationship. That was one of those unfortunate things that happens when you're helping your child with homework. But it stuck with me that there was this awful tension, in part based on not really having heard each other. And so I think when you're dealing with extremely controversial issues like homosexuality and, in this case, abortion, there is the debate over the moral issue itself, the content of the issue, that is significant. But there's this other layer, another moral issue that has to do with how do we disagree with each other? How do we approach controversial issues without just demonizing each other? I think that that we are right to try to listen to the opponent, even though we know we're not going to be convinced, for several reasons, in part because we're fallible. We may not think that we're wrong, and we may know that we're not wrong, but maybe part of what we hold isn't entirely correct, and that we can have that portion of what we say corrected by listening to an opponent. I think also that just listening correctly, even though it may not lead to agreement, and I don't believe it will, we can learn to live with one another. We can learn from one another. And that's what I hope to do as we look at the issue of homosexuality. Of abortion. If you'll just briefly, you have this handout. Look at the side. I'm not going to read all of this. I'm not going to read it to you. But the italics describes what I just said, that I'm not here trying to persuade one side or the other, not inviting you to try to enter an arena where you would be persuaded, but really only wanting to analyze the debate. When we turn to the other side, which has 7 points, on the side that you're saying, I said we're going to look at 6 points of the argument, and then you turn it over, you'll see a chart with 7. I apologize for that. The chart in itself is a little bit incomplete. Side A is what pro-choice would say, and the next column is B, pro-life, and there should be a third column that says common ground response, but that's what I'm going to give you verbally, and I didn't put that part on the chart. I will read one thing that's on the other side, the front of the page, and that is this quotation from Lawrence Tribe, who has written a book called The Clash of Absolutes, which is exactly what's at stake in the debate over abortion. Each side holds to a moral absolute. That absolute is the value of life, that you can't destroy life, no matter how early stage life you're talking about. The other principle that's being absolutized is the one is the right to life, the other is the woman's right to choose. So each side is holding to an absolute, and those absolutes clash. And Lawrence Tribe describes the debate this way. It seems telling that in Roe v. Wade, both the woman on the one side of the verses, Roe, and the fetus on the other, represented by Wade, are nameless. In much of the debate over abortion in our society, one side or the other is reduced to ghostly anonymity. Many who can readily envision the concrete humanity of the fetus, who hold its picture high and weep, rarely see the woman who carries it and her human plight. To them, she becomes an all but invisible abstraction. Many others who can readily envision the woman and her body, who cry out for her right to control her destiny, barely envision the fetus within that woman and do not imagine as real the life it might have been allowed to lead. For them, the life of the fetus becomes an equally invisible abstraction. I think it's a nice presentation of how the two sides are emphasizing each something important, in my opinion, and often neither side able to hear what the other is saying is valuable. So if you will turn to the chart itself, I'm going to go through each of those 7 points and briefly describe what's printed already, how each side responds to the other, and then describe what I believe could be a common ground response, a way that we might move ahead more respectfully. How each side refers to the other. Pro-choice advocates often refer to the pro-life position as anti-choice rather than pro-life. In some arenas, you never hear pro-choice use that term pro-life. It's just automatically anti-choice. They do that in part, they think that pro-life advocates are only concerned with the life of the fetus, that they have no concern for the pregnant woman or teenager who's struggling with an unwanted pregnancy. And they believe that pro-life advocates want to eliminate a woman's right to choose. And so they reduce their criticism, their understanding of the opponent to this term, calling them anti-choice. Pro-life advocates, on the other hand, often refer to the pro-choice position as pro-abortion rather than pro-choice. They charge that pro-choice advocates don't actually support choice. That's why they want to refuse to use that term. And they point to that as evidence when pro-choice advocates don't really offer any choice other than abortion. They don't actually offer a woman or a teenager the choice of adoption or bringing the baby to term and keeping the baby. And so they refer to their position, their opponent's position, as pro-abortion. Common ground response to that inability to call each other by the name they call themselves. I would say pro-choice advocates are not promoting abortion, as the term pro-abortion suggests. Pro-abortion and pro-life are not parallel terms. I think that's part of how you don't refer to an opponent in a way that would be parallel to the term that you call yourself. Whereas pro-life advocates do want a person to choose life in every situation, a pro-choice advocate is not advocating abortion in every situation. It's not really fair to reduce their position to pro-abortion. Pro-life advocates, on the other hand, are not rightly called anti-choice. Nor do they all disregard the value of the woman. That's where I want us to recognize, you may know some pro-life advocates who really only focus so much on the right to life of the nascent human life that they do ignore the woman, but I know many pro-life advocates who don't do that. So this is where we want to be sure we may be criticizing some people who stand within a group, but not everybody. They want women to be free and empowered to choose for life by bringing the pregnancy to term, finding a way to keep the baby, or putting the baby up for adoption. My suggestion in this common ground response is, couldn't we agree to call each other by each group's self-chosen name? Just from the very beginning, if we could say, maybe we don't agree with the term pro-life or pro-choice, maybe we have objections to it, but could we just use those terms and then make our objections part of our conversation or our debate with one another. If we start by renaming the other, by refusing to call the opponent by the name that group uses, I think we've already lost any chance that we might actually be able to speak to each other. So that I would suggest that from the very beginning we simply would agree that we're going to use the terms pro-choice and pro-life. The second point that I have there is what the Bible says. This is, I teach in a Christian seminary, and so I'm especially concerned about how Christians approach this debate. I do think that the Christian view gets in the news more than any other religious view. But the biblical passages that I'm referring to are actually all from the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible. So this could at least, may also extend to Jewish pro-life and pro-choice advocates. Pro-choice advocates rightly point out that there is only one passage in the Bible that directly mentions something that could be related to abortion, to the losing of a fetus at the hands of another human being. And that's in Exodus 21, 22 and 25 to 25. In this passage, it's talking about a pregnant woman who is harmed by another human being accidentally and loses the fetus, loses the baby. What's the punishment? Well, if the pregnant woman were killed, the punishment would be an eye for an eye, life for a life. But if the unborn child is lost, then it's monetary. The person who inflicted that harm would pay the husband money, so that the fetus, at least in that instance, is being treated similarly to property. And so pro-choice people would point to that, and some make the point that that biblical passage supports their argument for abortion rights. Pro-life advocates, again rightly in my opinion, point to passages in the Bible that aren't speaking directly about abortion as the loss of a fetus at the hands of another human being, but where God claims knowledge of a person developing within the womb. They're actually some of my very favorite passages. They're beautiful. That, to the psalmist, you knit me in my mother's womb. This affirmation that from the very beginning, God knows and loves us and calls us by name. Job 31, Psalm 22, Isaiah 44. Pro-life advocates also, because they believe that the fetus, the unborn child, is an unborn child with the same moral status as a child already born, also point to the commandment against killing, thou shalt not kill. What I'd like to point out about both is that with all moral issues, I don't think people who refer to the Bible should do so by what they call proof texting. It's sort of like a battle of the text. Well, it says this or it says this. You hold up one text or several, but isolated texts, and say that this is what the Bible says. Each of those passages needs to be read in the light of surrounding passages, the practices of the time, and in light of the biblical story as a whole. I do think that the passages that are highlighted by both sides are important, that it is significant to some extent that in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the fetus at that point is not being treated with the same moral status as a child already born. But I don't think that many of us, even those of us who are pro-choice, would want to bring that attitude into society's understanding now of nascent human life. I don't want the unborn child, the fetus, to be considered property. And I certainly don't want it to be considered the property of the husband or the father. So we really can't take that passage just as a whole and incorporate it into the contemporary debate over abortion. I do, as I said, love those passages where it says that God knows us. From the very beginning of life, we are known and named by God. Does that mean that those of us whose faith is based on the Bible, in the case of Christians, Old and New Testament, for Jews, the Hebrew Bible, that never could a religious person say that life that is known by God from the very beginning might be sacrificed for the sake of the life of the mother or for other reasons? I don't think it's simple enough to say that we can use those few passages and say never. It's complicated. I actually think that both those sides can have integrity in the way they're using the Bible to come to different conclusions. I don't think that the Bible is absolutely conclusive on this issue. So I wish that we could acknowledge that and look at the text that the other side is using. So that's what the Bible says. We come to the third one, how we refer to nascent human life. I'll tell you already why I'm smiling, because what I used to propose, and I'm going to propose it here, but with a qualification, is that I think nascent human life is a nice compromise way between saying the fetus and the child. But I had somebody tell me in another presentation, she said, I kind of had to pause and remember what nascent meant. She said, it's not like I didn't know it, but it's just not a word that I use very often. She said, if you're going to come up with a common term, I think you need to find something that's more street language, that, teenagers aren't going to know what nascent human life means. So maybe, you can help me come up with a different term. But it is a term that I use. I think that it's a nice designation, but I've come to see that it has limitations. Pro-choice advocates tend to avoid the term child and use the term fetus to refer to nascent human life almost exclusively. They charge there is a vast difference, they hold there is a vast difference between a fertilized egg, a multicelled embryo, and a fully developed child. And so they say fetus. And science is on their side. These are real terms that are used for real reasons. And this is very important in the stem cell debate, embryonic stem cell debate, where abortion comes into play, because in embryonic stem cell research, you are talking about the destruction of a fertilized egg. There's been some debate about people who are in favor of embryonic stem cell research to refer to the pre-embryo, that it's really not embryonic stem cell research. You're talking about a stage prior to the embryo. And pro-life advocates have said nobody's ever used that term pre-embryo. That's not fair. Actually, it is scientifically correct. They don't use the word pre-embryo, but it's a blastocyst. It's a different stage, or it's a fertilized egg. It's a different stage of development, actually, than embryo when you're talking about embryonic stem cell research. The terms are important. When you look at, if you go to your doctor, they're there for a reason that it designates stages of development. But I think that pro-choice advocates use the term fetus for a reason, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Pro-choice advocates tend to avoid the term fetus, and they use the term unborn child, or baby, or sometimes the unborn. They charge that they claim in an unwanted pregnancy, in a wanted pregnancy, a woman would always say my child, not the fetus. That actually the language, and I think they're right at that point, is highly loaded. Now, I've always agreed with that point, and I still do think the language is loaded, but I always agreed that if you're pregnant and you want to be pregnant, you don't talk about the fetus. And much to my surprise, when I was pregnant with my first child, in the beginning, I referred to the fetus. It was very much a wanted pregnancy. I was a little startled to be pregnant. You would think I didn't know how that happened. It just couldn't be. I was just like, how did this happen? My doctor was laughing at me. A woman in the waiting room was laughing at me. And maybe it wasn't for political reasons, had nothing to do with the abortion debate. I did find myself saying the fetus. I think maybe I was just trying to give myself time to get used to this, which I very much wanted, but kind of easing into it sinking in. I really was going to be a mother. I really was going to have a baby. So it was a bit of a contradiction to what I've always thought was true, but for the most part, I still believe that they're right. That usually when a woman is pregnant and it's a pregnancy that she's very glad to have, she uses the language of child. At any rate, the language is loaded. I think a common ground response is to acknowledge some truth in each, as that there is truth in both languages. As I said, fetus is a valid scientific term. I have known women, I was surprised when I used the term fetus, but I've known women who early on, based on past experience or because of something that's known immediately, they know that there's a good chance they may miscarriage. And I think that they use the word fetus in part to protect themselves, and I wouldn't want to take that away from them. On the other hand, I do think that some people who choose to have an abortion use the word fetus to protect themselves. And in some ways, at that point, it's self-deceptive, that they don't really want to admit that this is a potential child. That's not the language that I use, but at least that it is human life and it is a part of them that's being destroyed in abortion. For some of us, there is a distinction. It's why I'm back to wanting to defend a little bit the language of fetus. A fertilized egg, a blastocyst, an embryo, a fetus, few weeks, 4 months, 6 months, 8 months. For me, and I know for some of you, there is a distinction. So the change of language happens. When the distinction is, besides scientifically, when one stops referring to the fetus and begins to talk about the child in the abortion debate, that's difficult to say, and something that I'll return to on one of the other points and that maybe we could talk about. I have proposed, as I said, but I think that it's not a fully working proposal, that maybe both sides could say nascent human life. It is human life. I mean, we can't get around whether or not it's a human person is a different moral issue, but it's not feline, it's human. Nascent human life, I liked that because it's the beginnings, the very early stages of development and somewhat beyond the very earliest stages. I thought nascent human life was a good way to go. I think this may be, though, a place where we just have to agree to disagree. I do object to the term of the pro-life uses of the unborn. I think that maybe they should reconsider the objectification that gives to a certain stage of life that doesn't actually carry, to me, the same human weight that they're trying to convey with the word child or unborn child. The unborn, I think, doesn't quite capture that. But at this point, I'm not sure we could come up with even a better term than nascent human life. I don't know if there's any way that we can get around this except to acknowledge the language is freighted, and I think that it's used sometimes for very, very particular issues in this debate, which may or may not carry over into other arenas where we're talking about having a child. So that's those first three. The next one, 4, which follows very closely along the last one, is the relationship of the fetus to the woman or to the teenage girl, to the person who's pregnant. Pro-choice advocates, and this is back to part of Lawrence Tribe's quote, they emphasize the individuality of the woman because the fetus is totally dependent on the woman. It has, in their argument, it has no independent status as an individual entity, at least until the point of viability, where the child could live outside the mother's womb, or it could survive it on its own. It is understood to be part of the woman's body, that it is her body. This entity is totally dependent on her, and the decision about its future should therefore be hers alone. Is in brief how that argument goes. Now, there are different degrees of that, and people who hold to pro-choice position, different individuals would put that forward differently. The independence of the fetus or the unborn child. Some would actually and have gone so far as to compare the fetus to an appendix, to a bodily organ of the woman, and sometimes the term fetal tissue is used, which is even taking one step away from fetus. Fetal tissue sounds like something even a little less human, less something that our hearts would understand as significant life. But other pro-choice advocates don't do that. They don't say this is the same as an appendix or this is fetal tissue, but they still do emphasize the independence of the woman or the girl, of the person who's pregnant. Pro-life advocates emphasize the individuality of the fetus, of the unborn child, reminding us, one of the arguments that's often put forth is that the fetus, the unborn child, is genetically unique. It has its own DNA, a combination of both parents, but in that combination, something totally different than either of them. Now, it's interesting. I feel like this has gone off. Are we okay with? Can you hear me? No, because I don't hear myself the same way that I was before.
This is still on.
Okay.
Is the green one?
No.
The battery maybe too. Why don't you go on? I'm going to look for a battery.
Okay. If you knew me, you would know that my husband and I are quite sure if we believed in demons, we would believe that they are alive and well and are healthy in the technological equipment, because we're obviously very unlucky people when it comes to technology. At one time, our phone, our computer, our TV, and something else were all on the fridge. So we are at the relationship of the fetus to the woman. Pro-life advocates emphasize the independence of the fetus and make one of their arguments has to do with the genetic uniqueness of each individual. What I was about to do is make an aside, but I think it's an important one. For the children that we give birth to, it's a combination of the mother's and the father's genetic makeup, and so unique. That won't be true if we ever succeed at cloning a human being. In that case, the genetic makeup of one parent will be identical to the child who's born as a clone. It's a delayed twin. And I still would argue, I would affirm the pro-life argument at that time, that child is still unique. I really want to argue against the notion that if we ever do bring a child into the world through human cloning, that somehow that child belongs to somebody else, belongs to the parent clone rather than being an independent entity. Twins have the same genetic makeup, and we think they're, independent entities. So that claim is being made by pro-life advocates on the part of every fetus. And they also say that being totally dependent on another doesn't make an individual less a unique individual. That we would say that about newborn children are very dependent, totally dependent on the adults around them, and yet we say they have an independent existence. The common ground response to that argument, I think, for me, there is truth in both of those points. That on the one hand, one cannot rightly maintain, I think, as some pro-life advocates say, that the baby is not in any way part of the mother's body. There is a unique physical relationship between the pregnant woman and the fetus. The fetus is totally dependent on the woman in a way that's never going to be a true again in that child's lifetime, even though many of us as mothers would like for it to be so. We would like for us to be just as close to our children once they're born as we were beforehand. But it isn't so. There is something unique about that stage of development. It's not the same as an appendix, as just an organ in your body, but there is a physical closeness that's part of the wonder of pregnancy. That's part of the reason I don't want that denied. That baby was part of me for 9, and in one case, almost 10 months. And there's something about that that I think shouldn't be denied. And the woman alone experiences the changes in her body and what's happening in her body during pregnancy. But on the other hand, one cannot rightly maintain, as some pro-choice advocates do, that the fetus is no different than an appendix or another organ. For those organs can't become a human being. And to lose an organ, an appendix, is certainly not the same as having an abortion. There are people besides the woman or girl who's pregnant who are affected by an abortion in the way that they wouldn't be affected if it were the loss of some other part of the woman's body. Okay, great, thank you. All right. So that what I'm arguing for a common ground response is the suggestion that we say in utero, or more poetically, in the womb, you have a stage of development that's unique to all of human development. There will never be a time when the mother and child are that closely connected. I remember when And yet also at the same time say with pro-life advocates that this is a unique entity. This isn't just a part of the woman's body that's a matter of indifference to that particular nascent human life. I remember that when my first child was born, and when I left her for the first time with my mother and went to the grocery store by myself, and once I reached the grocery store, I started hyperventilating. I realized I had not been without this other human being with me, part of me, for close to 10 months. I had not been alone without this child. And interestingly, what came to my mind is I felt like I was missing a limb. So that image both emphasizes this child was part of me, just like a limb. But on the other hand, that child was not just a limb, not an organ of my body, but was born as an individual human being. The moral status of the fetus, I'm going to try to move a little bit more quickly now to make sure we have time for conversation. Pro-choice advocates do not consider an early stage fetus, at least, to be a human person in the same way that a fully developed baby is, a baby that's already born. This is one of the reasons for refusing to say baby or unborn child. I think very few pro-choice advocates give the same evaluation to the fetus at time of conception, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, what I referred to before. I do think a lot of pro-choice advocates see a distinction there. And the question then, of course, is at what point in the pregnancy does the status change? So that you're talking more about a fetus, an unborn child with the same moral status, or at least something closer to the same moral status as a child already born. Pro-life advocates often consider that a human person equal in moral worth to a child already born begins at conception. Exists with a fertilized egg, and that's one of the reasons for the refusal to say fetus and the insistence on saying unborn child. Now, some pro-life advocates don't actually think that at conception you have someone with the same moral status as a child already born. They may push it to some time differently. Again, just wanting to remind you that not all people in one group think the same. But there still is a sense that at least fairly early on, you have a human being, and some people, some pro-life advocates have even argued that the right to life should be protected by law. Constitutional rights should be extended to unborn children. Common ground response, the life that develops within a woman or a teenager, as I said earlier, is unquestionably human. I just think I really resist any denial of that by saying fetal tissue, by not understanding that this is human. It's not feline. Whether it's a human person is a different question, but that it has to be identified as human, to me, is just a fact we can't deny. Is the human person with the same moral status as a child? Here, I can't find any place for kind of a common ground understanding or language. It's simply a place where we disagree, and it's a very serious disagreement, and it's why if we can even find common enemies to argue against, common things that we could work on together as pro-life and pro-choice, it's not going to be the nature of the law, what should be legal, because if you believe there's a full human being at conception, you're going to be hard-pressed to allow someone to end that life. I'm going to do something here I haven't done on the other points and won't do on the next two, and that is give an explanation of where I stand, because this is the part of the debate that most puzzles me and I've had the hardest time wrestling with over the years. Why? Because I do believe that this is nascent human life, and I think that a life ends when an abortion is performed, and yet I still am pro-choice. And so how do I make that? How can I possibly say that? And I do think at a certain point in pregnancy, I would be, as it develops, less and less willing to support abortion except to save the life of the mother. The only way I've ever been able to explain my position, it's a feminist argument because it's based on women's experience, but it's not a fully developed argument, and it's not one that many of my colleagues in ethics would accept. But if I can imagine myself rocking a baby that is already born, who is already born, while I'm pregnant, and for reasons I can't even come up with a scenario, but I have to choose between the life of the baby in my arms and the life of the baby in my womb. it's not, especially early on, it's not a moral dilemma for me. I know I would choose the baby I'm rocking to sleep. I know that without having to pause very long about it. Now, if you asked me to choose between my children once they were already born, Sophie's Choice, I can't stand to watch that movie. I just say, we'll just all three walk into the ocean together. I'm not making that decision. And if I were pregnant and if the pregnancy ended in miscarriage, even very early on, I know, because I have friends who've been through it, that I would grieve that as the loss of a child, that my grief would be real, and I would resist any friend saying to me, oh, you can have another, like they would say that if I lost a baby already born, so that I can acknowledge the loss of life and the significance of that life. And yet the only way to date I've been able to explain why I think under certain circumstances that life could be ended, when I would not argue the same for a child already born. What I've just said is the best I can come up with, and I invite you again to reflect and respond to that. I will go through these last 2 points. Listening to women's experiences with abortion and with adoption. The pro-choice advocates claim, and I think rightly, point out that there are women who have regretted their decision to bring a pregnancy to term and put their child up for adoption. They believe that they were too quickly encouraged to make the decision, and they were not told how difficult it could be for the rest of their lives. They feel like, I've heard especially teenagers say this, they were treated like queens when they were having this baby, when they were pregnant, and it was known they were going to give the baby up for adoption. They were the center of the universe until the baby was born. Some of them weren't so much as allowed to hold their baby in their arms because of the incredible fear that they would change their minds. The baby's whisked away, and they go from queen to enemy, because the adoptive parents are terrified that this girl or this woman will change her mind. And I'm very sympathetic with that fear. But they weren't warned about what this could feel like, and weren't treated, once they made the significant decision they were encouraged to make, with the sort of respect that they felt like they should have been. Pro-life advocates, on the other hand, emphasize that there are women who have regretted their decision to have abortions, who believe that they were encouraged too quickly and without enough explanation what it might be like, how they might, for the rest of their lives, regret what they did. I talked to a young college woman long after she had had an abortion. She knew my position, and she looked at me and she said, what I did was wrong. You can't tell me that it was okay, and I will never forgive myself. And I certainly couldn't sit there and say, oh, whatever arguments I could put forward. She regretted what she had done. And she believed that she wasn't warned that she might feel that way. That was a decision that she made too quickly. What I want to say in terms of common ground response is that not all women respond to abortion or to adoption in the same way. I know women and girls who have put their children up for adoption. They've taken an unwanted pregnancy to term, and they are so proud of what they did for the baby and for the parents who needed a baby, given that they couldn't give the child that life. They don't have that lifelong regret, though it may have been very difficult. And I know women who've had abortions who don't experience that lifelong guilt. They can live with what they did. They made the decision they felt like they had to do. What I would like to say is that both sides need to listen to these stories, even if they are not the stories that we want to hear. What we tend to do is only put forward the stories of women and girls whose stories support our side. So we want to put forth women who feel that they were WEBA, women exploited by abortion, were women in Fort Worth a number of years ago who would tell stories of how they regretted what they did, and their stories should be heard. But that same group who supported them wasn't putting forth stories of women and girls who didn't regret it, or of people who regretted adoption. We need to listen to all of those stories and tend more to the girls and women who come asking us for advice, and be honest with them and not just push our one agenda. Finally, being honest about the nature of the most controversial procedure used for abortions. It's called late term. by pro-choice advocates, partial birth by pro-life advocates. And this is where I personally felt duped by people who held to my position. And I think that both sides need to be held accountable for not telling the truth in order to promote their point of view. Pro-choice advocates wrongly identified what pro-life advocates call partial birth abortions as late term. And I accepted that because it was coming from groups that I trusted. Now, I do know, because I saw them interviewed, there were a group of women who went to Washington when this debate first began to be in the news, who had late term, that means third trimester abortions. They're very rare. There are not many places in the United States that have them, and it was this procedure, DNX, dilation and excavation, is that? Extraction, thank you. They wanted those babies. They had horrendous experiences of health crises where they had to go through this procedure, and they were there to explain that. And the men, and they were all men, on the Senate committee that listened to them crucified them, as did the people who knew that they were testifying. They went to say, this was a horrible thing I had to go through, and they were abused all over again. I took those stories and I took facts that were being generated by pro-choice groups, and I taught my students in class that this particular procedure for abortion is late term and therefore rare. And it was wrong. They're not typically late term. They can be, as they were for those women, but they are that procedure more often is used in the second trimester. Pro-choice advocates, on the other hand, wrongly identify what pro-life advocates wrongly identify what pro-choice advocates call late term by calling them partial birth. It is somewhat true to the procedure. The child is born all up to the head. The body leaves the woman's uterus, and then the head is crushed so that it can be delivered. But by saying partial birth and using terms like, why don't you just let the baby live, is wrongly saying that in most of those abortions, the child, which might be true if it were late term, is far enough along that if you just delivered the baby, then the baby would live. That also was politically motivated and incorrect. I want both sides to be more honest. And it's really odd to me. My form of ethics is contextual. I don't hold to absolute principles. I'm not utilitarian, but I hold to a contextual view so that what's right in one situation may look different in another. And the criticism of my way of doing ethics is that it's relativistic, that, well, I just make it up as I go along. Oh, you could do this here and this now. And what stuns me is that people who hold to absolutes, in this case, absolute right to life, absolute right of the woman to choose, are the ones who are willing to manipulate facts, just, promote lies. If you believe that your position is the right one, and especially if you believe that it's the one that God would have you hold, there's this tendency then for anything goes. You can lie, you can manipulate, you can do whatever, as long as you win the political day. And that's one of the things I want both sides to be held accountable for, that it isn't okay, even if you think your position is so right that it should be accepted. I still think that your position is diminished if you have to lie and manipulate people to try to get them to change their minds. It is a grim procedure. There's no question about it. But all abortion procedures are grim. And I don't think that's the reason that they're either moral or immoral. We're talking about whether or not it's acceptable to end nascent human life. The procedure that brings about that end, I think that we become distracted when we look at that particular aspect of the abortion debate. So those are my 7 points. There could be more. I added the seventh one early on. It's why it said 6 on the other side. It is about 5 of 9, and that gives us 15 or 20 minutes for any comments that you'd like to make. Mm-hmm. That's an interest, right, excuse me.
And I'm going to really ask you a quick question. I was really struck by the point you made about holding the baby, baby in your arms.
Mhm.
Have you put that question to pro-life people in terms because I have to imagine that would include almost every mother, whether they're pro-life or
Right.
pro-choice.
Well, I certainly say it in my classes where I have pro-life people, and I don't know how they respond, but I typically get a very positive response to that story among women who are listening. Does it change pro-life perspective? I don't know, and it's almost not my point, but just to explain. It's the best I can do to explain. His first comment was that, and I hadn't thought about it exactly in this way before, that the debate is made harder because one side, seemingly pro-life, is more grounded in religion than the other. I've always looked at that, but now I have to rethink that I think the media right now is really interested in promoting a certain Christian view on a lot of issues that is not true to the Christian church and its members, which hold a variety of views. I know a lot of religious people who hold to a pro-choice position. But what I hadn't thought of is it true? Maybe it is, that though there may be religious pro-life and pro-choice people, are the pro-life people more likely to be religious? Are there an equal number of non-religious, secular, philosophical reasons for being pro-life? I hadn't thought about that. That could be. But it is definitely part of the problem that religion comes into view. I think that part of what the media also wants to do, when the news of Dolly first came out, I was invited to write a little piece in the Washington Post, as was a scientist. And it was real clear to me that the journalist I was working for wanted me, as the Christian ethicist, to be absolutely not, this is horrible, and wanted the scientists to be, oh, there's nothing wrong with this is great. And both of us were struggling a bit more with that. It was brand new. We were kind of trying to get our heads around it, and I was, more, let's be cautious than I was positive, but I wouldn't do what she wanted. What journalists want is this real clear this and this, so that in the abortion debate, I think you tend to get the extremes, the most radical voices that are yelling at each other, that can't stand each other, whereas I think a lot of us, pro-choice and pro-life, are a little bit more towards center, even if we stand where we stand very firmly, but we do recognize the complexity of it. Complexity is not what journalists really want. So, but I'll give some thought to what you're saying. If the dominant religious nature of the pro-life group is simply the case and makes it harder. I think that's a good point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is this very odd contradiction that's been pointed out that pro-life people, let's talk about Christians, tend to be pro-life on the abortion issue, but supportive of war and supportive of capital punishment. Whereas, let's stay within Christians, pro-choice tend to be pro-choice on that issue, often against war and often against execution. There is something inconsistent about that, but there are those positions, the Roman Catholic a bit more, though they do have a just war theory, and sojourners, Jim Wallace and who you may not know the names, but they call it the seamless garment, or it's an argument that's pro-life on abortion, anti-war, and anti-capital punishment. There are Christians who hold to that, but you're right, it's rare, and why that is, I'm not sure I can answer it. It's a very significant observation. Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. And I think that was that college woman I talked to felt that hadn't been done for her. And I remember when I was in college saying no woman would ever, or girl, have an abortion just for birth control because it would be such a horrible experience. And I was wrong. I mean, we could add to this list and the statistics. I mean, I am for abortion, but I mean, I'm for abortion being legal. But I'm not for abortion for every reason that people choose it. Sex selection is one of them. Feminists are in this odd position for supporting legalized abortion, which means that sometimes we're supporting women and girls. Sex selection abortion is almost always because they don't want a little girl. And this whole notion of wanting to remain naive about what one is really losing. I agree with you. That's why I want, if you know somebody seeks abortion, they really do need to understand, not necessarily, I think, to try to scare them or persuade them out of it, but to really help them understand the seriousness of it and can they live with this decision. Here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is not a fully thought out argument, but in terms of common ground, could the discussion of the relatively high rate of natural loss of the fetus, could that come into the argument as somewhat of a natural process,
Right.
Within days or months? And it's, anyhow.
It does enter into it. It's not a very persuasive argument, I think, but it still is a point that there are a certain number of miscarriages that happen naturally. And does that say anything then about some of the reasons that we may choose to have an abortion? Again, I want to distinguish between what I think are morally acceptable reasons and ones that aren't. For me, it absolutely would be to protect the life and health of the girl or the mother, though I readily admit that that's not the reason that the majority of abortions are performed. But I do think that just the fact and the perspective, the more that we know that miscarriages occur, it's important. I don't think it's one of the major persuasive points. I'll move to the left here, and then I'll go that way. Yes?
Can you understand, I should ask if anybody can understand, how a group that's responsible, like the Republican Party, can promote the idea of pro-life, even in the event of incest,
Right.
rape,
Yeah.
or the danger of
Right.
a mother's health?
I can to some extent, but I really do want to say a lot of Republicans, a lot of pro-life people will make those exceptions. So I don't want to say everybody who's pro-life won't make an exception when the woman's life is in danger or at the result of incest, and I respect that. The reason why it's difficult if you're pro-life to make those exceptions, even though it just seems cruel to say otherwise, is that if you believe this is a human person, the same value as a human person as a child already born, then if you allow for exceptions, which you would not allow for a child already born, there is no reason you can give for killing a child. It doesn't matter what circumstances, we're not going to promote that. So that it actually puts a huge burden on them to explain the inconsistency. If it's the result of incest, are you saying then, in this case, it's not actually a human person? I'm not defending their position, but do you understand why that really would challenge this fundamental claim that it's a human person to be treated like a child already born, so that even in those exceptional cases, you still have a child. But again, I do want to say there are pro-life people who will make those rare exceptions. Yes?
To me, there's another issue which isn't brought into it, and that is the whole question of the exploding population. And it brings it directly when you look at China and the one-child policy. And of course, both sides have views about this. But in fact, the population of China has come to the point where the government feels they really cannot allow the population to explode as it would naturally. And yet, the only solution seems to be to cutting back on the number of children who are born.
Right.
Yet,
Of course, in China, there's just this horrible situation where you have this humongous imbalance of the number of sons to daughters. And where all those little boys are going to grow up and find wives, I can't figure it out. They're going to have to leave China if all of those little boys are going to grow up to find women to marry. I think there are girls who are That's abortion for sex selection, is that everybody wants a little boy because in that culture, a little boy is going to grow up to take care of you, a little girl is going to grow up to leave you. I agree with you, but it's back where I was in college, I don't want abortion to be a form of birth control. That we need to back before that and say, and that's where, if we really were talking about common ground, where could we work together, would be how can we prevent unwanted pregnancies before we reach the point of saying that abortion is necessary. So the population problem, if you visit West Texas, you really sort of wonder that there is such a problem. I'm from Texas. But if you're in a place where a crowded city, a crowded country, which I don't think we always, every day, have in mind, it is a problem and it should be addressed. But I would hope not through abortion, but through birth control methods. Uh-huh.
As you frame the discussion on the 7 points, you very clearly frame it, and take the common ground, which appears to be a neutral result after looking at the two sides. There seem to be 2 points, 3 and 4, that may be objectionable on the pro-life side, referring to nascent human life, the relationship of the fetus to the woman. Do you find that the pro-life can accept that position? I'm sorry, pro-choice can accept that position, since it seems more inclined to be pro-life, or 3 and 4, or and just in your experience when you presented the common ground, you find that there's objections or more objections from one side or another to your common ground.
Right. I'm not sure. I'm sure there are. I'm not such that I have seen a pattern, and it's maybe because I haven't given this that often. But sometimes I don't think that the common ground position is necessarily neutral. Sometimes I'm really just trying to say, I really would like each side to understand how loaded their language is and examine that and the reasons behind it. But then maybe back off and say, if we really want to move forward, maybe we have to let pro-choice people say fetus and pro-life people say unborn child, and then move on to what, if we really are trying to find some way that we can address this issue where there'll be fewer abortions sought. So, but you're asking a good question. I actually don't know if one side or the other has found what I'm presenting more problematic to itself. I would like to know that. Uh-huh. Right. Right. That's a good point, and I honestly I don't. That's something that would be worth pursuing because I don't know the answer to that. I'm just so focused on the debate at hand. A lot of us. I'm 57, and I do remember when abortion was a federal offense, and if you look back in the history, just horrendous things that happened, and the desperation that women saw that led to some of their deaths. What they would want for punishment for that, I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's a very good question that I'll go home and do more research on. Mm-hmm. I'll come up to this.
You made a point of showing how each side is, in a sense, entitled to some respect and has good points. In light of that, I wonder how you feel about Roe v. Wade, which does take out of the democratic process a real ability to make a decision on one side as opposed to the other.
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, if there's room for honest disagreement between two sides, we usually fight that out, that issue.
I see.
In the democratic
Right.
process.
No, right.
Roe v. Wade basically
Right.
precludes
Yeah.
legislatures from.
Right. No, at that point, I think there is no room for common ground. If I were going to go on to say what are the sorts of things that we could work on together or work against, unwanted pregnancies, the extent that poverty enters into this, the extent that sexual violence and teenagers, we'd all like to reduce the number of pregnancies in teenagers. But if you get to what should be legal, then I think that we part ways. I don't see a way because I want abortion to be legal in some form, and there'll be pro-life people who don't. And so I at that point, you really are talking about one side's position is going to be represented in the law and the other's not. And I don't see any way around that.
Well, except that it was fought
It would be voted on.
Yeah.
I see.
It's the process the value here. Now, I happen to agree with you. I think it's a
Right.
very, very tough issue. And what I would point out for those who would want to overturn Roe v. Wade is if you did have a state that made abortion illegal, the woman would never have a choice. Whereas in any state where it's legal to have an abortion, the woman still always has a choice.
Right.
To me, trying to work through this issue from a constitutional kind of democratic
Right.
standpoint, that is critical. But I would really underscore, because I think most people here, probably like myself, agree with Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade, from a standpoint of democracy, is a very problematic.
Yeah. His point is we never did, as a nation, get to vote on the legalization of abortion. Roe v. Wade was a Supreme Court decision, and so he's not necessarily arguing against the law, but saying it is a problem within the debate that we didn't, as a society, get to vote on it. Somebody, Oh, I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, I wasn't paying attention to the time.
Yeah, from the religious objection to abortion, isn't it the heart of the matter based on when God grants personhood to the nascent human life? And since God knows, and we don't, when exactly that happens, that there's some uncertainty, that there's therefore wiggle room, common ground available to resolve this issue. In cases of rape and incest,
Right.
life of the mother, you have uncertainty on one hand and uncertainty on the other.
I think that you can argue it both ways. For me, the argument that God gives life and only God can take it away is just totally undone by modern medicine. End-of-life issues. I go much further than a lot of my colleagues in Christian ethics to believing that people have the right to die sooner instead of later when they know that they're dying. And people say you're playing God. I would argue we're playing God when we let people live longer than when their time to die is actually up. Are we playing God? I guess that's what you mean. Am I determining? No, I misunderstood what you said.
Well, I'm saying it's a question of uncertainty.
Right.
We don't know what God has in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we have more room.
Oh, I see. You're the other. That could be one way to argue it. I just, yeah. I think that's an interesting way of putting it that I hadn't thought about. Thank you. Thank you all very much.